In this video, we're going to talk about the earnings per share ratio and the price to earnings ratio. So let's begin our discussion with the earnings per share ratio, also known as the EPS. You can calculate it by taking the earnings or the net income of a company and dividing it by the shares outstanding. Assuming if the company has no preferred dividends to pay out. If it does, then in this case you can calculate the earnings per share by taking the difference between the net income and the preferred dividends and then dividing that result by the number of outstanding shares. So those are the ways in which you can calculate the EPS for a company. So now let's go over an example. Let's say we have two companies, Company A and Company B. Now let's say that Company A has $100 million in earnings. And let's say that Company B also has $100 million in earnings. And let's say that neither of these companies are issuing any preferred dividends. Let's say they have no preferred dividends to pay out. Now let's say that Company A has 10 million shares outstanding and Company B has 50 million shares outstanding. Here's a question for you. Which company has the higher EPS value? Which one is the better deal to buy? So the EPS value for Company A is going to be the earnings divided by the number of shares. So 100 million divided by 10 million, that's 100 divided by 10. The EPS value will be $10 per share. Now for Company B, we need to divide 100 by 50. 100 divided by 50 is 2. So it's going to be $2 per share. So if everything else is equal between these two companies, it looks like Company A is a better deal because the earnings per share is higher. Now it's important to know that as the earnings of a company increases, the earnings per share will increase as well because they're making more money. These two are directly related. Now, as the number of shares outstanding increases, the EPS value, the earnings per share, will decrease. These two quantities are inversely related. So as we saw in the case of Company B, it had more shares, 50 million compared to the 10 million shares of Company A. So even though the earnings was the same, because Company B had a greater number of shares outstanding, its earnings per share is a lot lower because you have to divide that 100 million in earnings to 50 million shareholders if each person had one share. Now let's talk about what the EPS values mean. A company with a high EPS value is a company that is doing pretty good. They're making money. A company with a low EPS value, they're not doing very good. They're pretty much doing bad. So let's say if you have two companies, one has an EPS value of, let's say, positive 560. Let's call this Company A. And Company B has an earnings per share of, let's say, negative 380. Company B is not doing well. Because the earnings per share is negative, that means that they're losing money. They're not making money. But for Company A, because the earnings per share is positive, that tells you that they have earnings to report since the last quarter. They're doing good. So a positive EPS value tells you that the company is making money. A negative EPS value tells you that the company is losing money. That means that their expenses is greater than their sales or revenue if the EPS is negative. Now let's talk about the price to earnings ratio, also known as the PE ratio. Now there's two ways in which you can calculate the PE ratio. Here's the first way. You can take the market value of the whole company, which is basically the market capitalization, and then you could divide it by the earnings of the company. So that's one way in which you can get the PE ratio. The market capitalization is equal to the number of shares outstanding times the price of the stock. The total earnings of the company can be calculated by taking the shares outstanding and multiplying it by the earnings per share. So if you cancel the number of shares outstanding, you get a second way of calculating the PE ratio, and that is the price of the stock divided by the earnings per share, or the EPS value. So those are the two ways in which you can calculate the PE ratio. So let's use an example. Let's say we have company A and company B. Let's say that the share price of company A is, let's say, $40, and company B, the share price is going to be the same, 40. Now we're going to say that the EPS for company A is $10 per share, and the earnings per share for company B, let's say it's $5 per share. So which company has the higher PE ratio? Would you say it's company A or company B? So to get the PE ratio for company A, it's going to be the stock price divided by the EPS value. So 40 divided by 10 is 4. So that's going to be the PE ratio for company A. Now to get the price to earnings ratio for company B, take the stock price of 40 divided by the earnings per share of 5. That will give you 8. So what do these numbers tell us? Let's say if these two companies are in the same industry, and let's say everything else is about equal. A low PE value indicates that the company might be undervalued. A high PE value might indicate that the company is overvalued relative to company A. Now, for most companies in the stock market, the average PE ratio could be anywhere between 20 and 25. So relative to a typical company, both of these companies will be considered undervalued. But company B will be considered overvalued relative to company A if these two are in the same industry. So keep that in mind. A low PE ratio indicates that the company is undervalued. But a high PE ratio is an indication that the company might be overvalued. Now, sometimes you may have a stock with a high PE ratio and the stock's price could still be climbing higher and higher. In that case, investors believe that there's a lot more growth potential in this company, so they're willing to pay a higher price for that stock. Sometimes a low PE ratio may not be a good thing. Sometimes the stock price might get lower and lower. So you have to be careful. Just because a stock has a low PE value doesn't mean it's always the best thing to buy. The price of the stock can continue in a downtrend. It can keep getting lower and lower. So you have to look at other factors as well. But something you do want to know is that as the price of a stock increases, the PE ratio will increase as well. As the earnings per share increases, the PE ratio will decrease. Those two are inversely related. So the PE ratio just tells you if a company might be undervalued or overvalued. It tells you the current state of the company and not where it's going, not the direction. You have to look at other things for that. So now what we're going to do is we're going to work on some practice problems that help you to understand how these things are calculated, like the EPS and the PE ratio. Now here's a problem that you could try. Number 1, a company has $450 million in earnings and 300 million shares outstanding. The current price of the stock is $30. Part A, what is the EPS value of this company? So feel free to pause the video and try this problem if you want to. Let's begin by writing down the formula. So the earnings per share is going to be the earnings of the company divided by the number of shares outstanding. So the company has $450 million in earnings and 300 million shares outstanding. So canceling the unit millions, it's going to be 450 divided by 300. And so the EPS is going to be $1.50 per share. Now let's move on to part B. Calculate the PE ratio. The formula that we should use to calculate the price to earnings ratio is the stock price divided by the EPS. So the price of the stock is $30. The earnings per share is $1.50. So dividing those two gives us 20. So that's the PE ratio for this company. Now let's move on to the next problem. Number 2. Company XYZ has $4.2 billion in net income and $300 million that it must pay. I put is, let's take that out. That should be it. That it must pay out in preferred dividends. The company has 900 million shares outstanding and is trading at a stock price of $45. Calculate the earnings per share value. So let's begin. The EPS value is going to be, now we have the preferred dividends in this problem, so we're going to use this formula. It's going to be the net income minus the preferred dividends divided by the number of shares outstanding. Now we need to make sure that the unit matches, because here the unit is in millions, here it's in billions. So it's important to understand that $1 billion is equal to 1,000 times a million. So it's 1,000 M. So $4.2 billion, to convert that to millions of dollars, you would multiply that by 1,000. So this would be $4,200 million. So the net income, I'm going to replace that with 4,200 M. That's 4,200 million, and the preferred dividends is 300 million, and the number of shares outstanding is 900 million. In order to get the answer right, you want to make sure that the units match. So 4,200 minus 300, that's going to be 3,900. So we need to divide 3,900 by 900. And this will give us our EPS value, which is going to be $4.33. It's 4.3 repeating, but we're going to round it to the nearest cent. So that's the answer for part A. That's the earnings per share value. Now let's move on to part B. How much is the price to earnings ratio for this company? So let's calculate the PE ratio. So keep in mind, we have two formulas. We can take the market cap and divide it by the earnings, or we can take the price and divide it by the EPS. Now we know the price of the stock and we know the EPS value. So this is going to be the best way to get the answer. So the stock price is $45. The earnings per share is $4.33. And so the PE ratio is going to be 10.39. And so that's it for this problem. Number 3. Company ABC has a market capitalization of $2.8 billion and has $400 million in earnings. And there's no preferred dividends in this problem. The stock is currently trading at $35. part A. What is the PE ratio for this company? Now we have two ways. We can take the stock price, which we know, and divide it by the earnings per share, which we don't know that value. We need to find it in part B. So we need to use the other formula. That is, we need to take the market value of the company, the market capitalization, and divide it by the total earnings of the company. So once again, let's convert this into the appropriate unit. If $1 billion, as we said before, correspond to $1,000 million, then $2.8 billion, just multiply by 1,000, this would correspond to $2,800 million. So the market cap is $2,800 million. The earnings is $400 million. So we could cancel the M, we could cancel 2 zeros, and so this becomes 28 divided by 4, and so the PE ratio is a nice whole number, 7. So now that we have the PE ratio, let's move on to part B. Let's calculate the EPS value. So the equation that we've been using before to calculate the EPS value is this one. We took the earnings of the company and divided by the shares outstanding. But as of now, we don't know the number of shares outstanding for this company, so we can't use this formula. The only other formula that we have that has the PE ratio, the EPS value, is this one. The PE ratio is equal to the stock price divided by the EPS. We know the stock price, we know the PE ratio, so if we could rearrange that formula, then we can calculate the EPS. And here is the rearranged formula. The earnings per share is going to be the price per share divided by the price per earnings ratio. So the price per share is $35. The price per earnings, it's basically $7 per earnings. So dividing these two, we're going to get the earnings per share. 35 divided by 7 is 5. So the EPS is $5 per share. Now, for those of you who may feel dubious about this, you can confirm it using this equation. So the stock price, as we said before, is $35 per share. The EPS is $5. 35 divided by 5 is 7, which gives us the PE ratio. So that's how we know the answer is 5. So now you know how to calculate the earnings per share if you're given the stock price and the price to earnings ratio. Now let's move on to part C. Estimate the number of shares outstanding for this company. The only formula that has the number of shares is this one, but we need to rearrange it. The number of shares outstanding, there's actually two ways in which we can calculate this. The number of shares outstanding is going to be the earnings of the company divided by the EPS. So I rearranged this equation by switching these two things, which is what I did here. I switched the PE ratio with the EPS to get this formula. So the earnings is 400 million and the EPS is $5. Now it's not 5 million, so this unit will not be canceled. It's going to be carried over. So if we divide 400 by 5, we're going to get 80. But it's not going to be 80 shares. If we carry over the M, it's going to be 80 million shares. So that's one way in which we can calculate the shares outstanding in this problem. The other way is by using the market cap. Earlier in this video, we said that the market capitalization is equal to the shares outstanding times the price of the stock. So to calculate the shares outstanding, we can take, you need to divide both sides by the price, by the way, for those of you who want to see how to get the rearranged formula. The shares outstanding is going to be the market cap divided by the share price or the stock price. So the market cap is 2.8 billion, which is 2,800 million. And the price of each stock is $35. So 2,800 divided by 35 will give you 80 as well. Carry over the M, you get the same answer, 80 million shares outstanding. So as you can see, there's a lot of different formulas that you could use to calculate what you need to calculate. So that's it for this video. If you like it, don't forget to subscribe, and thanks again for watching.